G'day there, welcome to part 3 in this series. We're going to have a look at investing in NDIS housing. Let's move on to the NDIS investments. So having a look at the photo here, this is really bad design. And you know what, the longer you look at the photo, the more you realize, gosh, this woman's life is not great. She's in a wheelchair, she's completely mentally competent, but having to pull out or insert plugs, not super safe. How does she get the kettle off the stove without dropping it on her lap? How does she access this microwave oven? Well, she doesn't, because she's got another microwave oven right next door, meaning that's completely useless. She can't access anything above, and yes, she can access the stuff below, all these other cupboards, but then they're in the way if she ever wants to do the dishes. This is a standard family house, and it is not appropriate for somebody who has disabilities. But if you have a look at houses that are constructed for this purpose, things are better. With a push of a button, this man can lift the entire surface. There are houses that are built with voice-activated services, being Google and Siri, say, table, kitchen, 50%, and the table moves. Or what about if you have a serious bone disorder, so you need to be hoisted out of bed and lifted to the bathtub? How do you actually get somebody into a bathtub? Well, there are solutions for that, but again, you can see that all of these amenities they're expensive, and they're not always appropriate for a standard family house. So you can invest in the National Disability Insurance Scheme in Australia using special disability accommodation. Most participants in the NDIS don't need a house that is designed for their disability. Participants, by the way, are people who have a disability who are under a permanent and significant disability and are aged under 65. The 65 cap is because once you're over 65, then you can go to the aged care sector. So this scheme offered by the Australian government it's bureaucratic, and it has quite a lot of language and jargon you have to get used to. The NDIS is operated by the NDIA, the A stands for the authority, that's the government department. The disabled person is known as a participant, which I think is a very dignified term. The SDA provider is the person who will manage the house. Now, you cannot effectively self-manage one of these homes like you could with a regular rental home. Every business that provides either a good or a service to a participant and has that paid by the government under their NDIS plan needs to be registered with the NDIA. These businesses are known as authorised providers. Specifically, because we're talking about special disability accommodation, so the housing side, we're talking about the SDA provider, which, if you're the investor, you can just think of them as the real estate agent who is managing the house. Now, there is a terrible shortage of SDA housing in Australia. So in general, the rules changed about 3 years ago, and that meant that at the time, everybody who was in some form of accommodation was in a house that no longer meets the new rules. So Australia has to go ahead and build thousands and thousands of houses for people who need disabilities, and the government is not particularly interested in having old houses retrofitted to meet the circumstances. Because of the nature of these disabilities, and because building codes have changed, all these houses pretty much have to be built from scratch. Now, disabilities can be very, very broad. So there are 4 main categories of SDA housing, which we'll have a look here. There are 12 different types of houses which you can have a look at, but specifically we're looking at the 4 categories, and they are improved livability, fully accessible, robust, and high physical support. We'll put robust to the side for the moment. Improved livability is for dwellings that have been updated to be appropriate for someone who has sensory, intellectual, or cognitive impairment, but these are generally relatively light changes. So say, for example, if you're vision impaired but not blind, you might be able to live mostly by yourself, but we could do things like, for example, paint the door jamb bright orange and a door black with a nice contrast so that you can live an otherwise normal life. Fully accessible, think mostly wheelchairs here. There's much more to each of these, I'm sort of skimming over it, but we're trying to get a drift here. High physical support is for people who have a high level of physical needs, they often require full-time carers, and they might even require effectively life support. And so there are provisions to make sure that every house has emergency power, basically a UPS supply, to make sure that you've got 2 hours of power even if the lights go off. Robust, on the other hand, we've got a little picture of a boy who's beating a wall here. That's very much a thing. There are people with very serious cognitive disabilities, and they can be overwhelmed and become quite violent. And so in these houses, which they look like houses, but by gosh, they are built super solid, you can't rip the doors off, and you certainly can't rip the door handles off. The TVs will be behind several inches of perspex. The roof might be 3 meters high ceiling, so you can't smash something into the ceiling, and the walls, you can't punch the walls. They're just too heavily built, you know. All of the furniture is bolted to the floor. There are escape places so that if a participant gets particularly cross with a carer, the carer can escape and be safe, basically. So there are some very serious provisions that go into building particularly high physical support and robust. You just can't repurpose these houses into a regular family house. They're just built for purpose, and they're built with these disabilities in mind. There is a price guide. I have included a link here, but you can just Google search the SDA Price Housing Guide, and that will tell you exactly how much money the government will pay, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But suffice to say that the yields are quite high. The business case of the government is, well, look, suppose that you are seriously disabled such that you need constant care. Oftentimes these people were originally placed into hospital care, but that costs the government almost $1 million per annum to keep someone in hospital. If they were to put you into, say, a nursing home, that would be $300,000 of running costs. But if the government was to pay even $100,000 for rent in an appropriate home, well, hey, the government's saving a lot of money here. So rents, yes, they're very high, but it makes sense for the government to do so. As I mentioned before, these houses are designed as special disability accommodation, and generally they shouldn't be repurposed, or at least it's very difficult to do so. Because of their special needs, the construction is quite complex. Everything must be built to the exact millimeter or it will fail the inspections, and that will add substantially to your construction costs. And unfortunately, that additional construction cost over a regular 3-bedroom house will not be recognised in the bank valuation, so the investor will have to come up with that cash by themselves. There are other benefits, such as if a resident was to move out, the government will still pay you rent for another 60 days after a resident vacates. So, I mean, that's a huge boon. But remember, you're talking about very small markets here, because each house is sort of designed with a specific need in mind, and if there isn't an appropriate person to rent, well, hey buddy, you've got a very expensive house that you can't rent. Now, I won't go through this too much, but if you go through the government price guide, they do have a formula as to how you can calculate the amount of rent that you might receive. If we have a look at a quick scenario here where we're building a house for 2 participants in North Adelaide with an on-site overnight room for a carer, and we're doing this in the category of high physical support, the two people will receive an SDA allowance of $90,000, plus they also get some rent assistance of $17,000. So the landlord of this house would be able to pick up $107,000 per annum. And mind you, this is before costs. Depreciation is pretty high. We're talking about doors that will open on voice commands. There's things that can be broken there, and management fees will be substantially high. Everything about this house is a little bit, it's more difficult than the standard house. There are pitfalls for investing in NDIS. You need to be aware of the demand and the location that you're picking. So if you're talking about wheelchairs, don't build on a hill, pick somewhere flat. Unfortunately, there are a lot of property developers that are pushing land that's not appropriate. Here is a great facility that will help investors pick a location for their SDA house. If you scroll down to the bottom here, we can click on See Demand, and it launches a little mapping service. And let's say we want to pick on Victoria, and I want to pick on the city of Geelong, all right? And I know that there is a university around here, there's a hospital around here, so there's plenty of services for disabilities. If I click on this local government area, this municipality, it will tell me the postcodes there. It will tell me exactly how much money they expect to be spent on the NDIS program in that financial year. If you scroll down, it will also tell you the number of participants that they expect for autism, for intellectual disability Downs, for mental illness, and so forth. Let's go pick on another regional area, like, I don't know, Sale. Let's do Sale. Scroll into Sale, click on Sale. Here we can see that we've got many fewer people. I mean, Sale is a much smaller town. Autism is up there, developmental delay, intellectual disability is down. That's another option. There's also Warrnambool. I know that there's decent demand. So if you click on there in the city of Warrnambool, you can have a look at the numbers here about how many people you would expect, what sort of disabilities they would have, and that will help you pick what category house you might want to build. Next thing, of course, I mentioned is bank valuations, because they don't recognise all the additional costs that go in there, so that may not be recognised as an asset. Generally, of all the things I'm talking about this evening, this will have the highest yield, but it is terribly complex. And we're always talking about new properties here, so beware of commissions. Yeah, builders will definitely pay commissions in this area. Sourcing land has also been quite difficult as land prices have increased in Australia, and also be aware that the NDIS is, seriously, it's bureaucratically complex. Thanks for watching so much to the end. If you got this far, why don't you give me a like, because hopefully I earned it and hopefully you found something helpful here. And you can also subscribe, because very soon I'll have the next part out. And of course the link will be either in the description below or the card above, and we'll have a playlist out there, so subscribe.